Hello, everyone, and welcome to Loop and Learn's special event today on managing menstrual cycles and loop. It's an unusual and very important topic, and we have Jenny Smith from Integrated Diabetes Services and also Juicebox Podcasts with Scott Benner, and Carson Wedding, also a T1D and a college student, and really smart, and all of us who are T1Ds have lived through having menstrual cycles and trying to manage diabetes, and it's not an easy one, and I think you'll learn a lot today. So here we go. As we normally do in our presentations, is just a disclaimer that the Loop app is a do-it-yourself closed loop algorithm to help automate insulin delivery. It is experimental and not approved by the FDA. Patches or customizations are even more experimental. This presentation is provided to assist you in making your own decisions in consultation with your own healthcare professionals regarding your own diabetes self-management, and you take full responsibility for building and running this system and do so at your own risk. So I mentioned we have two panelists today. So Jenny Smith is the Director of Lifestyle and Nutrition at Integrated Diabetes Services and has lived with type 1 diabetes since her childhood. She holds a BS degree in human nutrition and biology from the University of Wisconsin, and is a registered and licensed dietitian, certified diabetes educator, and certified trainer on most makes and models of insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitoring systems. Carson Wedding is a sophomore at the Colorado School of Mines studying, here we go, Quantitative Biosciences and Engineering. She's a smart girl. She has lived with type 1 diabetes for 12 years since she was 7 years old. And this summer she has an internship at the Barbara Davis Center studying the impact of the menstrual cycle on insulin sensitivity. We will all learn from what she learns this summer. And we often get asked, how do we give back in this community? We always welcome some volunteer help or input on Facebook, but if you want to support the larger community, please consider a donation to the Night Scout Foundation. You'll see it on the rerun of this video on how to get to the Night Scout Foundation. It's nightscoutfoundation.org, and they will welcome any kind of input. They help the community enormously with developers and others trying to help others. So I'm going to stop share right now, and I'm going to turn this over to Carson to take away the show.
Awesome. Give me just 2 seconds to pull up my slides. But a little bit more background, my internship this summer will be doing data analysis on some existing data to hopefully figure out more specifics about how the insulin sensitivity is affected by the menstrual cycle. There's some papers out there that view the cycle into 14-day units, but I'm hoping to figure out how that looks on like the 28 days divided up into 4 different cycles or sections of the cycle. Phases is the word I was looking for. So I'm very much looking forward to that. The Barbara Davis Center is the research center here in Denver. So here we go. Again, just a real quick disclaimer. One of the big things that led to this presentation tonight was a post talking about how it's very difficult to manage menstrual cycles, especially in younger teenage girls. I believe the post was about a 14-year-old girl who was having like uncontrollable, like highs, lows all over the place. And everybody was just generally like, I don't know how to deal with this. And that's very common. There's not a lot of research done about this, mostly because there's not a lot of research done on most medical conditions in women. There's just a gender gap in the medical field. I had to hunt down any kind of research papers about this. There was one in my college's database, and we are a pretty big STEM school. All of the other papers I've read on this topic I've gotten from the woman running my internship this summer. So it is not just you. There is a genuine lack of information about this topic. So what I have and can share is the most common trend is hyperglycemia before the start of period, up to, I want to say, 7 days before the period through the end of the period. And that's most likely a result of the decreased insulin sensitivity. There's also some theories that it could be a result of increased appetite that happens in the luteal phase. And there was one study that says there can be required up to 4 times the normal amount of insulin. So a whole lot. Generally, this is a your diabetes may vary type of thing. There we go. One thing that you can do is document big changes in your glucose control. This is kind of something that you have to do over time, as a period is once a month. You can use an app to send push notifications, events like ovulation. You can include like PMS, bleeding. That's an easy way to make insulin adjustments when you can. You can easily just throw an override on loop, say, hey, I'm gonna need 120% of my insulin for the next 48 hours. Or like, once my period starts, my blood sugar tends to run low. So I can be like, all right, the next 3 days, I'm going to need 80%. The app I use is Clue currently. They are super great about not sharing data, which is important to me. I'm working on finding an app that provides more info about the hormones in all phases of the cycle. We'll update on that if I find anything I like better. But Clue is super user friendly. You can include all kinds of notifications. There's like sleep, there's like things about your skin, any period symptoms, like if you're cramping, PMSing, you can record like emotions during phases of the cycle. And then you can really customize your notifications, which is super great. Here, you'll actually see a screenshot from Clue. This is a post from Alex Quinn in the Loop and Learn group, I want to say from May 2021. So you can see how she divides up her cycle into these 4 phases here, starting with like the first starter for period through her ovulation. So that's one way to divide up your cycle. You can see here some of the hormones at play. So diabetes is an endocrine disease. All of the other hormones will affect it. I believe there's a specific protein involved in the menstrual cycle that has insulin receptors on it, which is really interesting. So there's hormones that are affected even more by insulin. So even in women without diabetes, insulin is affecting their cycle. So it's super interesting and really, really tough to manage when you do have diabetes. This is, again, your diabetes may vary type thing. Diabetic women are more likely to have irregular cycles, especially in the teenage years. I know like a big thing that I was seeing is parents, teenage girls beating themselves up about like, I don't know how to control this. It is what it is to some extent. There is documentation of diabetic women being more likely to have irregular cycles as a result of weird hormone fluctuations, all the fun autoimmune stuff. The body is super cool and fun that way. And then one thing that I really wanted to emphasize is that management is a marathon and not a sprint. I've seen a lot of posts about like my daughter is down to like 70% time in range, and that is still phenomenal. Like I remember going into like my diabetes meetings with like the dietitian and the endocrinologist when I was like 10, 12, that age, and they would pull up my Dexcom sheets and they'd be like, if you're above like 60%, you're doing great. And I think that's really important to recognize, especially when you're dealing with teenagers. That's a very important time in diabetes management, and that can be super, super high pressure and not fun to deal with. So I wanted
Carson,
yes.
just want to pause a second to see if Jenny has anything she wants to add based on her experience in a clinical environment. Oop.
Absolutely.
Sure. You had a really nice, kind of clean and very simple, I guess, slideshow or presentation to kind of go through everything. One thing I wanted to mention, because it's on the top of my head, you were saying that you use the Clue app to track.
Yes.
It is a nice one. If you're looking for something that's a little less expensive and you've got some teens that you're working with, not necessarily like, you know, college age or into, I don't know how many women here might be concerned in terms of like preconception or whatnot, where you might need a little bit further tracking. Period Tracker is a really nice one that's very simple, not very expensive. I even use a free version, honestly, at this point.
I know I use the free version of Clue and it's still pretty robust.
And it's still pretty robust. For those that might be wanting a little bit more, as you were mentioning, not that you may be planning it right now, but there is one that's called Inito. It's INITO. There is a cost to it. So again, it would be more for somebody who's really trying to get a visual of all of these hormones. You had a really nice graph up of all of the hormones through each of the phases. And our menstrual cycle is really, it's not really just the bleeding phase. I like that you mentioned that as well. It's really a whole month period of different sections,
Do
right?
we want to scroll back to that slide?
Sure.
Yes, can do.
So
Maybe-
it's nice, but the Inedo app
go.
and tools that you use with it actually will help a woman to track all of these. Again, it's something that would be a cost. There's a device that actually slides over your particular phone for the camera part of it. And then it comes with testing strips. If anybody's familiar with like ovulation test strips, it utilizes those types of strips for you to essentially pee on, which track the hormones through your whole cycle. And then it gives you graphical output that you are actually having a normal cycle, or that you're ovulating or not ovulating. So
Interesting.
it can give you a lot of really a wealth of information, so to speak. Again, it's not like a $7 app, which is a little bit more beneficial if you really aren't interested in like conception, but it's beneficial. So I wanted to mention that one because it was a newer one that I had heard of recently.
Absolutely. That's super interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, in terms of all of the fluxing that happens in the cycle, there's certainly a reason for it. And the sensitivity versus the resistance to insulin that women with diabetes end up seeing through their monthly cycle, that on this graph here, you can kind of see post-ovulation is where that major hormone that has the most impact on resistance. It's called progesterone. And so as it rises in the phase after ovulation, that's leading to either, if you're trying to conceive, that progesterone level will continue to stay high as it does during pregnancy. But once your body knows that conception has not happened, then progesterone levels kind of start to fall off into your kind of menstruation starting. So many women, somewhere between about 3 to 7 days before the first day of their period, end up with the heaviest resistance. And that can be the hardest time to kind of figure out, well, what do I need? And it kind of goes back to, you said your diabetes may vary, and do some charting and some noting, which all around really good total points to put together in a short little couple of slides. Because if you can track and you know what happens in this early phase after your period has started up until about ovulation, that would be for a woman who is not utilizing any birth control. That would be the time period of most consistent or normalized insulin need. And then once you get into ovulation and thereafter, you're looking at a little bit more resistance. So if you have an idea of how your insulin needs are prior to the need for more, you can track and see on average how much higher are my blood sugars in this time period. It may give you an idea of, especially using some of these AID or sort of automated insulin delivery systems, which piece to throw in. Is it with loop something like an override? At what percent of an override do you need to use? Is it 10% more? Is it 20? Is it 30? Sometimes it's even 40 or 50, depending on how your insulin needs are on average. If you are a little bit more resistant overall, regardless of the time of the month, you might actually find you're somebody who needs 40 or 50% more insulin. An override may not touch that. You may actually have to go into your settings and adjust those up and let loop work off of those adjusted settings. That may work better for you. So it's a little bit of diabetes in itself is just experimentation. So it can be a little bit of experimentation overall.
Awesome. And then Joanne had a question about if there was a significant difference in cycle regularity based on levels of control, time and range standard deviation. I don't remember there being a clear correlation drawn, and that would be something I could look more into and get back to you on. And then insulin sense.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just about to
Yeah, I was just gonna say with that, what I've seen in the broad range of age of women who are having a cycle from the teen years all the way into women who are trying to conceive and even postpartum and all of that. What we honestly see is with more stabilized blood sugars, the more stable your overall cycle becomes. And if you are tracking hormones and looking at the regularity of insulin need going up and coming back down, the more stabilized your blood sugars are. I hate using the word easy, but the easier it is to get containment during your actual time period of resistance, the more consistent the increase in need tends to be, which is also then hard when you're considering the teen years, because the teen years are full of a lot of different change, hormones and growth and everything outside of a cycle are in the picture. There's stress and there's school and all the things that you can possibly include as a variable are there.
Yes, and then Joanne, going off of that with the personal medical information, I did some digging on Clue's policy on data sharing after Roe v. Wade was overturned and found they have a very robust policy of not sharing information. They are very transparent about not selling, not doing anything. It is just your data, which I really appreciate. I know there was a lot of apps, like Flow was a big one that I saw that went under fire for that. But I know Clue specifically, that's part of why I use it, is generally very safe. And then I'm not sure about the other apps Jenny mentioned, but I think that's just the case of doing a little digging and research on your own.
Right. Well, I know that the period tracker one in particular that I use, the free version, it actually requires you to back up your own data to your email in order to get it back to you. Otherwise, and in terms of sharing, it is something that I've looked into. Unless they've changed policies or anything recently, they are also not really sharing anything for any grand collection of information. So
yes. And then Sarah, I know a lot of these studies have been based on insulin resistance overall, and insulin sensitivity is just like the general, there's an overarching sort of, I don't know how to explain it. Insulin sensitivity is like overarching. And so that would be correction factor and carb ratio and basal. So generally this would be a time when like just an override would be great, because any insulin your body gets, it's going to be more resistant to. So you're going to need to do more basal, more correction, and more for carbs.
mm-hmm. I think there's also some women experience a heightened kind of need in a much shorter time period around ovulation. So again, if you are a woman or a teen who is not technically using any birth control and you are ovulating, you may actually find a really short period of really considerable resistance right around that ovulatory time. I usually tell women it's somewhere around 24 to 72 hours. Again, your visual of it may differ from mine. It may be heavier resistance, shorter time period than what you see in that progesterone rise, which is getting ready for your cycle to start. So you might have needs that differ, again, based on that segment of time of where you are in your cycle.
So is Carol. So a lot of times we have parents writing in because they're just overwhelmed, confused, where to start. So I guess just to go back through, we start with tracking, spreadsheets, notebooks, apps, anything they should be looking for. Your daughter be peeing on sticks, like what boil it down to make it super easy.
I am a big fan of the tide pool. That visual works really well for me. I try to make a point. That was one of like my big resolutions this year, was like having at least like one day a month where I like sit down, make sure all my data is uploaded, look through it, see if there's any trends. And so the tide pool like visual, their system is great. I believe you can also donate your data to Night Scout through Tide Pool, which is also super awesome. So that can go to people who are doing other research on Loop.
Yeah, that
recommend
was
doing
one
that.
I was going to mention is Tide Pool, because it gathers, I mean, for the most part, outside of those who use Omnipod 5, all the other systems can be downloaded, and Loop's data goes there right through your phone, through your Apple
Mhm.
Health and whatnot, which is awesome. And the Tide Pool app on your phone is so user friendly. It
It
shows
really
you
is.
your graph of CGM. You can write your notes in, you know, my period started, or if you are using testing around ovulation, you know, test it and like ovulation is happening, and all of that is visual on a 24-hour timeline in the Tide Pool online database then, and your notes pop up kind of like little sticky notes, which make it really easy to visually see CGM data. Here's my note that my period started. Oh, look, my insulin needs more sensitive, which is very common in the first 24 to 48, even 72 hours once your cycle, actually your period physically starts. Those insulin needs definitely drop off and come down for the most part, and again stabilize off until potentially around ovulation, and then thereafter with that progesterone kind of rise. So yeah, that's a nice one. I was going to mention there's another one, Under My Fork is another one that it's not specific in terms of like tracking your monthly cycle, but you oh sorry, go ahead. Oh, I'm echoing. Sorry, I heard myself and I thought somebody else was speaking in. It allows you to really track around food. So if you're really wondering if some of your needs change in terms of your insulin to carb ratios and that around your cycle, the Under My Fork is nice because it will bring up certain meals, and you can even look it up by date, and you can see what's ending up happening around those particular times. Your CGM trend and everything is right in there. So it gives you a little bit more feedback that's a little bit more around meals and foods and that kind of stuff. So.
So it's Carol again. So parents, again, I'm just going back to parents because the folks that I think is the hardest for, because if they're non-T1Ds, they've never been through this before, and now they've got a daughter and they're not sure what to do for her. So they go with a 10% override and then ratchet it up each time until they get it right, or is there a better strategy than that? Is it just hunting and pecking to find the right amount?
Pretty much.
You know,
I think you can kind of make a guesstimate first time. I would like personally, I am a little more aggressive with my diabetes management. So if I was noticing that I was needing more insulin, I would start with like a 130% override and then adjust from there. But if you are, you know, working with a younger daughter who you're concerned with like hypoglycemia at school or something, then I think starting low and working your way up is a smart move.
yeah. And starting your way on the low end, again, you may not see much difference, and then you can ratchet it up pretty quickly after that. Quite honestly, it only takes a couple of hours of an override to see whether or not it's actually helping. And again, you may find that there are times of day that you need maybe a little bit more and or maybe a little bit less. You know, in particular, my overnight needs are quite low comparative to my morning needs up until about like 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. So from wake up in that time, I need a little bit of a heavier override overall. And during my cycle, I actually don't need an override overnight at all. I need it mainly during the daytime. So I've figured out when to turn it on, how much I need, when to turn it off. It tends to be somewhere into the evening time, somewhere before dinner time. And then I can spend the rest of the time at my normal rates without an override and look pretty good. So again, a lot of making notes and figuring out. Now, in terms of using an override, let's say you're normally sitting at 100 when you wake up in the morning, and the cycle is coming, you know that your period tracker said that's 5 days out, right? And you start to see you're waking up now at 130 instead of waking up at 100. Well, a 30-point difference in where you're typically waking up, you could probably get away with something like a 10, 15, maybe 20% at the most increase. Whereas if your resistance is significant, that you're waking up now at 180 instead of 100, your override's going to need to be that much more aggressive. So noting again, where are you in that early place after menstruation starts up until about ovulation? That's your clean window, so to speak, of really normalized need.
Jennifer, I see what you're saying about 100% override barely touching the 14-year-olds. I have been pushing for Loop to add in different profiles for years now. If you want to help bug the Loop devs with me, that would be great. I know in Omnipod, there's a way that you can like program different settings and change that, but that's not a feature that's available in Loop. Feel free to complain about that. I've been trying to get there. There is proof that insulin sensitivity can change by up to 4 times the normal amount. And that's not something you can just do with an override. I think that would, yeah, I have to for help 5 years now.
Yes,
so
I
if
have
more
as
people,
well.
yeah, if more people pile onto them, hopefully they'll get around to it at some point.
Carson, did they respond to you on that request?
That is a great question. I have not requested recently. This was something that I brought up in like Loop Dev 1.0 stages while I was still being the guinea pig.
But I mean, it's.
I'm sorry,
Post
in
the
the
link.
chat, I just posted the issue number. If you go to that link, you can add the conversation. The problem is that there's no disagreement that we should have it. And this is just one way to do it, doing an inference capability. It's really better to have profiles, and this may not have been the best link to post, but there's no disagreement that it's a should be done. There's limited time in the day, but yeah, no,
it just
absolutely.
hasn't gotten there.
It hasn't. If I knew how to do it, I would have put it in, but
Yeah,
it's hard.
it is.
And with respect to insulin or any closed loop system, it goes beyond women's cycles. Because the issue for me with O5 is when and if I need steroids. So and anyone who has any kind of surgery will be given steroids, and overrides are essential. And tapering, so you can't go on something that's doing your last 3 days. So I always believe in letter writing campaigns and social media to try to get attention. And this is, I think, a very critical issue for all closed loops.
Absolutely. But I think the easiest way to do it is just go in manually and mess with settings and change it back. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a better way to deal with it if you're needing that kind of insulin difference.
In fact, even if you're reading a lot of the Loop documents and whatnot, and have listened to a lot of what Kenny Fox, I love Kenny, what he has talked about in terms of that percent override, there's a point at which you're getting too excessive in the percent. And it's really going to create lengthy hours out issues after you have used a percent override that is too high. And in that case, if you're finding that you're having to go 150, 160, and it seems to be working somewhat, but then things are just getting wonky and it doesn't look great, you're more likely to be the one who needs to go in and just look at your settings. I would suggest taking a snapshot of your typical settings and then adjust them so that you have something to go back to once the cycle starts, once your period starts. And then you have visuals of, well, what did I do last month? I nudged it up this much in the basals. Maybe you also need not only basal adjustments, but maybe you need an override on top of it. I mean, again, your diabetes may vary. So
Just
could I ask a question?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so we have an active teen, and then you have a teen that's just developed working on her cycle and things like not working. She's got her cycle, but it was late, so she was 14, and she's really active and trying to manage like the activity levels and pulling back insulin and then needing more insulin at the same time for her cycle. That's where I was going bananas because
Absolutely.
it was because the cycle makes periods of time where she's more resistant. I was starting to see that, but then all of a sudden she'd like have a crazy PE class, and then she dropped like a rock, and I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? Like, so, I set higher targets with the hopes of trying to offset it. But that was the part that was making me bananas, was trying to balance all the variables at the same time. I don't really know if there's much we can do other than just sort of like continue to layer on what you said. But I think for me, that was the biggest thing. It's almost like having a young child again who's doing like random playing and jumping on the trampoline and things like that. And I think, all of a sudden we were like super resistant during the day. And then she had like 2 hours of dance class. And although normally I would pull back 30% before she went in, and then she's dropping and it's not enough. And then like 50 carbs later, and it's like, oh my gosh, what's happening? So
does she loops as well?
oh yeah.
So
Okay.
Because honestly, you could expect that despite the resistance being there, if you're going to have an active time period, as you know what loop does already, right? It's watching what your current target is and what you've told it to work with and to do on top of that. Exercise will always, outside of maybe the morning time, whereas resistance anyway, and then you've got resistance on top of resistance in the morning time.
Exactly.
You may not need as much adjustment in the morning time, but after lunchtime into the later afternoon and definitely evening, watch how lengthy you're using overrides or where you've notched up those basal profiles. Okay. And expect that the heavier the override or the heavier adjustment up that you use, you're going to need to notch that back at 100%. Least an hour and a half to 2 hours before the activity even starts, because otherwise you've got to load more exercise and insulin, and it all doubles on itself.
100%. I guess I should refine my question a bit. So, okay, let's say I throw on, she's resistant because of it's her cycle time. I load on like, she's running at 130%. Then I know she's got an evening dance class coming, and that's 3 hours long. So usually what I would do is I would run a 70% override an hour and a half prior, and try and send her into class with zero, like as little IOB as possible, high protein, all that kind of jazz. For me, then all of a sudden I have like a 60% gap in.
That's exactly what I do.
That's the fiddly part. Is that what people are seeing? Is like, that in fact kids need the 60%, and then when they're active, I guess that's the question. Is it's like, because all of a sudden I have this huge range.
I was once upon a time a competitive dancer, ended up as a band kid, spent my summers doing band on a professional scale where I would get up at 8 a.m. and exercise all day. I legitimately would clock about 12 hours of physical activity before going to bed. Mm-hmm. So what I would do during these times, I generally would consistently run at 70%, like my standard. I would just set that as the baseline. Mm-hmm. And then when my period was happening, it would be back to basically normal.
Okay.
But that is on like a very, very intense level. When I was doing competitive dance, I know you mentioned your daughter was a dancer. It would definitely be something like you were talking about, where it would be 120% going in, eat dinner, knock it off, go on like 80% before going into dance class. So there is still that major jump. I think exercise is one of the few things, like exercise will drop your blood sugar in a way that doesn't have to do with insulin resistance. So you still need to account for it the same way you would not on your cycle.
Okay. That really helps.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's tough.
For sure.
I believe you. It's hard to deal with.
Yeah. It was more so like, it wasn't always the same. And I think that was the tricky part. And I kind of was just, and then, so that's really good to know. That's really helpful, actually. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's a lot of trial and error, and it just kind of sucks.
Yeah. And a lot of juice.
Oh yeah. The Capri Suns at Costco are life-saving.
Yeah, I have a question. So Jennifer mentioned how, I think you mentioned this, Jennifer, that for some people, the feet on the floor phenomenon can be even worse during the insulin resistance period, or may not happen during the menstruation period. And I know that's true in pregnancy as well. And I was just wondering, do we understand physiologically why that is? Like why the magnitude of that effect is different beyond the like just it's this fraction overall?
I would expect that it has to do with the hormones, right? Especially from the example of it being a little bit more pronounced in and around the very resistant time of your monthly cycle, right? That rise in progesterone. And even in pregnancy, where that progesterone level stays higher, right, which is a sustainer for pregnancy, you're going to see, especially in the morning time where you had resistance, its heaviest effect is still going to be there and is going to be heavier during that time of your cycle. Whereas because those hormones get downplayed, and we have this constant flux of them, as you could see from the graph, there's always some type of hormone like going on in a female body. And so when you are in that stage of your cycle where your period has just started, obviously you're now at the bottom level of those hormones. It's kind of like the starting point. They're all at their like base before they start getting ramped up at different points. So the sensitivity that comes in there is because there's been such a drawback of your overall hormones, that foot on the floor or maybe dawn phenomenon seems less visible. And or maybe just because the way that you've been adjusting your insulin doses, maybe you haven't really nudged them off quite as much as soon as your period starts. So they're actually covering you a little heavier than maybe they need to. And so you're not seeing the impact and it's offsetting what would naturally be there. So I know it's interesting to follow once you really start to understand the very big differences in female hormone navigation versus male. You can understand why I think that there needs to be a lot more education from the initial diagnosis for women or girls with diabetes, because the initial education has nothing to do with what to expect based on whether you're female or male at all. It's all just a baseline of insulin need and take insulin to cover carbs, and nobody prepares girls for what's going to happen, or mothers and families and dads for what's going to happen as their girl moves into their teen years, right? It's very different. Yeah. I mean, boys,
yeah, it's like
men
the
have
male's considered the
but,
default,
right?
When we're actually 50% of the population.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I've spent a whole engineering ethics class debating the ethics of using male crash dummies in cars, and that there were men in that class that still didn't get it.
All right, so we have a few questions.
Yeah.
How long does it typically take to gain a consistent cycle?
That is very much your body will vary. I don't think mine got consistent until I was about 17 or 18. So I'd probably been having my cycle for 8 years at that point. So a while, especially if you're very active, that also does not help. Yeah. So buckle up. It sucks.
In the teen years of activity, I think what we have now, comparative to what I had when I was a teen with type 1, I mean, we had no CGMs. We had none of the current technology. It was all MDI and finger sticks and do the best that you kind of can. So what we have in today's world is certainly a lot more visual in terms of benefit and what you can see. And what I've seen, again, with all of the women that I've worked with and the teens that I've worked with is, as I said earlier, the more consistent overall glucose levels are, or the more contained they are, the more likely that the cycle will become more normalized, let's say. But again, activity levels, girls are doing a lot of things, thankfully. There are a lot of sports, and there are sports that roll into another sport that completely does something different in terms of overall blood sugar strategy. So when you couple that along with trying to figure out what's happening with a cycle, and you think, well, her blood sugars are pretty darn great, and with the system that we're using, we've got really nice management, so why aren't these normal? Could have a lot to do just with the growth cycle and navigating activity and exercise. So, and the heavier the exercise gets, I mean, even as an adult, once I had a very normal cycle, I was probably in college by the time I had a normal, like 18, 19, by the time I had a much more typical standard, I could expect that my cycle was coming about when it was supposed to. But a little later, when I was around like 30-ish, I started doing triathlons, and I was training for a half Ironman. And I went into my doctor worried. I was like, I'm not pregnant and I haven't had a period in like 3 months. He's like, well, this is probably why. So, I mean, there are certainly, depending on training and how heavy into some type of activity your teen or you are as an adult, you might see some time periods where things look very irregular, and it's based on the activity.
So another question we have is, can you offer any suggestions on dealing with all of the irregularities and fluctuations that occur during perimenopause? So we're fast forwarding past the teen years.
Yeah. Perimenopause is another difficult time. It is. And in terms of perimenopause, there are studies that are relative to women with type 1 diabetes or diabetes in general. Some of the research is based on both types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2, suggest heavily that perimenopause may start earlier in women with diabetes comparatively. Again, some of the research also points to management and, that word we love, control. How good has the control been overall? And what might that mean in terms of pushing out perimenopause more towards the more typical time after the age of 45 to 50 for women who don't necessarily have diabetes, right? So it's a time of definite frustration for many women, because hormones, you could have been on a very normalized cycle, had everything down, had it all tracked, all of the changes were typical, and then all of a sudden, instead of 31 days, now you're at 28 days or you're at 26 days, and you're thinking, what's going on here? Like, what? I had this all set. Like, why is it going to change again? And along with that, you may revert back to somewhat like the teen years, where you're trying to figure out, well, this month I didn't seem to have a very heavy cycle, and gosh, I only needed 10% more insulin. And next month I've got this like really heavy all of a sudden, and it's considerable, and the effect is crazy, and I feel like hitting somebody and my blood sugars are this high and I need this much more insulin. So perimenopause can be as frustrating as the teen years.
I would say that there's a whole different level. You're absolutely right, because I've been through this. I had gotten it down to knowing which day to change for my profiles, and then I hit perimenopause, and all of those went out the window. Plus, I'm facing aging, and okay, no more babies. Not that was a high priority, but I couldn't. So I was told I wouldn't do it. So when you're a teen, you have the fear of becoming pregnant. When you go through perimenopause, you're going end of life. Oh my gosh, I'm not attractive anymore. So the emotions go to a different tailspin. But the erratic stuff is insane.
Yeah, it really is. And it's as frustrating. But I think, what those of you who are caregivers who have, daughters who are in those teen years, the beautiful thing that your teen may not be thinking of right now is that they've got you as a person that is helping. And thank goodness you're there trying to help, even if you're frustrated right along with them. For the women going through perimenopause, often it can be pretty lonely. And unless you are part of, thankfully there is the online community now that's very helpful and very talkative. But years ago, women didn't have a connection piece at all, and they didn't have the education or the information. So it could be very, very frustrating, feeling like something was all new all over again. It's almost like relearning diabetes management.
I'm Karen. I'm the one that asked that about perimenopause. Thank you for all that, because that's exactly how I feel. Like, I wasn't a teenager with type 1, and I was very, very normal. Now all of a sudden it's like, sometimes I think I need like 3 times the insulin, and some days I need like half of what I always do. It fluctuates. Sometimes I feel like sometimes it's like, a half a day or days. Yeah, it's frustrating.
Yeah. And along with it, I think perimenopause also brings in something that may not be as much experienced in the teen years of fluctuation. Is perimenopause can really bring a lot of fatigue at certain
Yes.
points. And that fatigue may get you out of the routine that was bringing some structure and regularity to your patterns. And sleeplessness, which we know has
Right.
major impact on blood sugar and on hunger levels, and with fluctuating hormones.
And the weight gain,
And the weight
despite
gain.
everything. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. I'd give you a hug if I could. I'm sorry.
Well, it's just nice to hear that everything that I'm experiencing is
Is
typical.
normal. Yes.
Yes. So, all right. Thank you.
I think something that I was going to mention and bring up as well, because certainly it is more common now than it was when I was, even in high school, but I'm sure and certain, having worked with a lot of teens, that to some degree, birth control becomes a piece in the mix, whether it's for regulating cycles or it's because of regulating very significant heavy cycles, or because somebody thinks that it might help to, again, regulate them. Obviously, the birth control, today's world, there are multiple options, right? And all of those pills or IUDs or patches, they bring in a level of hormone that obviously sort of tricks the body into not ovulating, right? And they're hormone based, right? Many of them are progesterone only. Some of them progesterone and estrogen kind of mix. The percents of mix are a little bit different. So they can certainly help to smooth some things out in people who do need them for certain reasons. But that may be another navigation point to evaluate, how has this changed things now that I've started taking it versus before I was using it.
I remember when I went to FFL for the first time, I want to say 2018, 2019, it was a discussion point in one of the teenage girl groups about using birth control as a way to regulate your cycle, because a lot of the girls had incredibly wild periods, and taking the pill helped them regulate that and get that consistent enough that they could track and use that to help manage their hormone fluctuations and how that affected their blood sugar, which was really interesting at the time hearing that. But it makes sense when you think about it.
The interesting thing about it is that, in terms of studies, and if overall all about, progesterone, and really like the phase at which the progesterone comes in, and sort of what that does, in terms of progesterone, its effect on the body is a little bit more like depressive, really, than the stage after your menstruation kind of starts, where those other hormones are sort of starting to flux in and then nudge up to a degree. So there are certain moods, and teens are moody anyway. So there are moods that come into the mix along with all of the hormones then that are creating, well, gosh, this couple of weeks, like everything looks happy and jolly. And then we get into this phase of the month and, oh my goodness, should I even like ask if they want dinner tonight, because I might get yelled at. So there is certainly another piece of consideration in terms of how your teen is responding to you about things, maybe very relative to hormones. So,
and going off that point, one big thing that I really wanted to emphasize going into this is that there is a lot of grace that needs to be given to teenage girls who have to deal with diabetes. Being a teenage girl is hard enough without a chronic illness and being responsible for your own life. It is a very difficult time to go through, and having to deal with changes in your body and your insulin and your cycle and all of that is very, very difficult. I have possibly one of the greatest support systems known to man in my father and my mother, and I still had incredible amounts of burnout going into my sophomore year of high school. So please, please, please try and be supportive and lenient and give your daughters grace. That is like the one big thing, if I can give you all anything to take away.
And
it
also
is hard, and it is hard on your part too. And it is just a difficult time, and it just kind of sucks.
I think the explanation too that I think had I known a little bit more as a teen about what we're discussing, it would have made sense. By the time teens get to sort of that like 8th, 9th into high school years, they've got enough understanding, especially with living with diabetes already. Their knowledge is deeper than the average teen girl, right? And explaining to them, this is why you might feel this way through the course of the month. This is normal. These are the changes that are supposed to be happening in your body. And, you know, I'm here to help. Let me in. Let me know how I can help to ease this for you. And again, they may kind of grumble at you, but overall, I think the explanation piece that everything that they're experiencing should be expected. It's normal for them to be feeling, because I think, as you said, that living with diabetes it's an extra burden on top of a lot of the things, especially with the social nature of high school and early college and everything that we have now that I thankfully did not have when I was growing up. There was not as much visibility or talk behind everything. So yeah.
It's a hard place to be in, both as a child and as a parent. If they're not listening to you, you're welcome to refer them to me as somebody who's been in that situation. You can also do little things like going and getting food after endo appointments, or offering to go get Starbucks and talk about their blood sugars that month. There are little things like that, just anything to make it easier, because it really, really is kind of sucky, no matter how you spin it.
Letting them voice that it sucks too, you know,
Mhm.
not trying to just code it over, oh, it's not so bad, and you know, whatever. I mean, they need a voice. They need to be able to say, this really stinks, and to be heard.
That was around the time where I started having like this really is awful. This is unfair. I hate having diabetes. I don't want to deal with this. Like, it's around the time where you start figuring out that you are really, really different from your peers around you, and finding that support system, whether that's from your parents or like the online community, is super helpful.
Yeah. And there are a lot of, thankfully now, I mean, it's great that you are, you know, saying, hey, reach out to me. I'm happy to talk. That's super awesome. We have at Integrated as well, we've got a really good mental health specialist. Her name is Anna. And she has worked with, which is now, it's not the College Diabetes Network anymore. It is now, what is it, Joanne? You know that College Diabetes Network changed to.
It's like the Diabetes Link or something.
The diabetes, thank you. Yes. So Anna used to work with that group, and now she's got her own consulting, but she does a phenomenal job working with families and teens and kids all on that mental health.
That was Anna Florian.
Yes.
Oh yeah, she's amazing. She's amazing.
Yeah, she's great. So
if people want to reach out to either one of you, what is the best way to do that?
I am on Facebook as Carson Marie. It doesn't like my last name, and I don't want to deal with verifying my ID. So that works, and I can also put my email in the chat right now.
yeah, my email is pretty easy too. It's just jennifer@integrateddiabetes.com. Or if you're just interested in Integrated and you're not interested in me, then just info@integrateddiabetes.com. Either of those is a good reachable or reach outable place. So,
and you both are, I think, are members of Loop and Learn.
I believe so. I will make sure I go and comment on that post so you all can find me.
Yeah. So you can message to each of you also.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think this has been amazing because it isn't fair. Just isn't, it's fair, but it's not fair. It doesn't really
Yeah.
matter if it's not fair.
It's an under-discussed topic.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Under-discussed.
So
You wouldn't be, you'd be amazed how many teens and women come to me, you know, at all stages, not knowing just what we talked about, not knowing the hormones and the fact that, gosh, it's not just weird around like when I am having my period, but the more that I look at it, gosh, I'm tracking and I'm seeing something pop up. It looks like a trend. And nobody told me to pay attention to this before. Nobody told me. The only reason I started personally tracking was because I got married. And at some point, I knew we wanted to have children. And I knew that there was something weird going on. But again, nobody told me anything. I did all my own research on my own. So.
oh, Jenny, the only reason I did is I married an engineer, and he said, "There's data here, you know," and
Yes.
he made me track, and I kicked and screamed.
Yeah.
Until it worked.
Well, that's wonderful that you had an engineer that was very directive and like, let's track this. Let's figure this out. Yes.
But it is data. I've heard it said so many times that type 1 diabetes is a data disease. And the more you aren't scared of the data, but you're able to look at it and talk to others who are doing the same,
Right.
gets you through it. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, Joanne, honestly, is that when I look at my data personally, I try to like step back from my emotional look at it, and it's just data. It's like when I do a finger stick to verify like my CGM, it's like, here comes a number, and what does it mean that I need to do? It's a starting point, or it's an evaluation point. And sometimes the emotions get the better of you. That happens. But overall, when you're analyzing data to get something out of it and to make some beneficial changes, it's good to sort of take the emotions and put them on the shelf for just a little bit.
Right. Yeah, and to have this, I mean, services that you guys provide, and the community that Carson is talking about, makes it easier to look at your own data, unless you love data, is overwhelming, and you have your period at the same time.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's hard. So what you've done tonight is start to open the doors, and I think it's fabulous. Thank you, Carol and Tina, for pulling this idea together. Carson, amazing. I will edit the video. It will be up. There's nothing much to edit. You guys were perfect. Flawless.
Thank you.
Tonight.
Awesome. Thank you for the invite. It was great.
Well, thank you, everybody. You know how to reach out. Don't get discouraged. It's going to be with you for a while anyway. So just kind of address it and ask for the help that you need. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
As
Alrighty.
well.